Welcome to another episode of Cooking for Wellness at NYU Langone Health. It is the first episode of season 2, and it's autumn in New York. That means apple season. Today we are making a simple and easy apple crisp with fresh local Hudson Valley apples, picked only about 50 miles from New York City. We've modified the recipe to be gluten-free and 100% plant-based. And since we are focused on gluten-free eating, we are joined today by our Chief Medical Officer and gastroenterologist, Dr. Brian Bosworth. Dr. Bosworth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
New York State has some of the best apples in the world, and we produce more varieties than any other state. So we've talked about gluten-free eating on Cooking for Wellness before because it's a very serious topic for our patients and one that requires a lot of attention. Dr. Bosworth, can you break it down for us? How actually common are gluten allergies and insensitivities?
So I think the first part is that there are people who have an actual wheat allergy. And that's not super common, but wheat is one of the 5 most common types of allergens. Celiac disease is an autoimmune condition where there's a response to gluten. Around 1 in 100 people will actually have celiac disease. And then there's a larger group, more like 6%, that will have true non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And then there's another group that really just don't feel well if they overindulge in carbohydrates, things with a lot of gluten. So those are various different ways that people describe them. But most of the time when people are talking about a true gluten allergy, it's really a surrogate for somebody who has celiac disease.
So do you find that patients coming in for treatment ask about diet choices and nutrition?
Patients love to talk about diet. Everybody loves to talk about food, and gastroenterologists particularly love to talk about food. I think it's really important. Food and nutrition play such an important role, not just in GI conditions, but in everything that patients come to the doctor for. There's an important aspect of nutrition. And when they're coming to see a gastroenterologist around abdominal pain or bowel issues, diet plays a critically important role in both the treatment as well as the managing of some of the symptoms.
Sure. Okay, well, let's get started with our apple crisp. So first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and preheat our oven to 350 degrees. This recipe typically is 375, 400 degree recipe. However, since we modified for gluten-free, we removed the all-purpose flour, replaced it with almond flour so that we had to lower the temperature of the oven just slightly. Okay. So we're gonna take a 1/2 cup of almond flour. So this is processed, blanched, peeled almonds, as opposed to almond meal, which is typically a processed whole raw almond. So you have about 3/4 cup of rolled oats.
Now, Jeff, when you substitute in the almond flour, when you make gluten-free food, do you typically use almond flour as your substitute?
You know what I do? I like the added protein, and I just tend to like the flavor of the nut flour. But I mean, there's plenty of different things you can use.
Sure. Almond flour is one of the ones that I think is really very good. It's got a nice consistency, doesn't have a lot of flavors or smells that might turn some people off to gluten-free. And almond, like you said, is really good because it has that protein component too, so it lets the starches and the proteins kind of mix and gives a nice consistency.
So the 1/2 cup of light brown sugar, have some cinnamon, a little bit of nutmeg, and just a tiny pinch of salt. You can go ahead and add that.
Okay.
So in the place of butter, we're going to use coconut oil today. So go ahead and combine your dry ingredients with the fork and just kind of fork the coconut oil into the mix.
Yeah.
We don't want to overmix. We actually want to encourage the clumps and the small lumps.
Well, this is going to be for that crumble on top of the apple crisp, right? And so it's nice to have a little chunks so that you get a little bits of surprise crusted with each bite that you're getting.
Sure, it's looking good. Yeah. We have 6 Empire apples. Go ahead and add that to the bowl. We have just a little bit of granulated sugar.
And for people who really don't like to add extra sugar, or for other dietary reasons can, let's say they have diabetes or they're conscious of their sugar and they're pre-diabetic, there are different ways that you can substitute, whether it's honey or agave syrup, or even putting in some strawberries that you've mashed up gives that sweetness to it and can balance it out. And I think since we're talking about apples have their own natural sweetness to them, and you can modify what type of apples you're using. So something like a Pink Lady will have a little bit more sugar than a Granny Smith apple. And so you can really tailor the recipe for these based on your own personal preference and dietary needs.
So we have a little bit of vanilla extract, a little bit of cinnamon and nutmeg. And like we spoke about earlier, we have just a quarter teaspoon plus an eighth of a teaspoon of xanthan gum. As you look through the internet, almost every gluten-free baking recipe contains xanthan gum. So, I mean, how do you feel about that? You comfortable using that?
So xanthan gum is really, it's some fermented sugar, and it's fermented with the Xanthomonas bacteria. And it's perfectly safe. It's very healthy. It's not healthy. It's not healthy. It really doesn't have much nutritional value. And you're using such minute quantities. But again, you're using that as a substitute for the gluten, which are these proteins in wheat flour that allow for the stretchiness and the stickiness.
So we also have the zest and juice of 1 lemon and a little bit more cinnamon. You can go ahead and add that. And lastly, we just have an additional 1 tablespoon of coconut oil, just to give it a little body. You can go ahead and combine that as best you can. All set and mixed.
All set and
Looking
mixed.
pretty good. Let's go ahead and add that to our baking dish. So anytime you're cooking a baked dish that could potentially drip or kind of bubble over in the oven, we always underline the baking pan just to make sure it doesn't drip to the bottom of the oven. Go ahead and add that as freely as you can. Just try to combine it, spread it out evenly.
And we put some oats in here also as part of this crumble. It gives it some substance and a little bit of texture. I think it's also important, if somebody is really conscious about the gluten-free aspect of the cooking, that they get gluten-free oats, because there can be some cross-contamination between the processing of oats in the same facility where they process wheat and flour.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and put this in the oven.
Great.
So I want to talk a little bit about the apples. So 95% of the recipes you see online for crisp and cobblers, it's always going to call for the apples to be peeled. For us, knowing that the skin of the apple contains the highest concentration of vitamins, minerals, and fiber specifically, it's non-negotiable. We leave the skins on. I mean, how do you feel about that?
The skins, I think, add a different texture to it. And you're right, there's more than twice as much fiber in the skins as there are in the rest of the apple. More than 300% more vitamin K, there's more calcium, vitamin C, those phytochemicals that you talked about, antioxidants, vitamin C. It's just so rich with all the good things that are in apples. And the fleshy part is, there's a lot of water, there's sugar, and there's some nutritional value to it, but really it's all about the skin.
Okay, so we cook for about 40 minutes at 350 degrees and it looks beautiful.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I wish everyone could smell this. It smells delicious.
Okay, so there you have it, a simple and easy gluten-free plant-based dessert made with local apples. You saw how fast we did that. Dr. Bosworth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Join us next month for another episode.